if they go to university. They didn't get support through Sure Start centres and youth clubs. Most of that has gone. They can't get on the housing ladder. They can't even afford to rent anymore, so unless they've got the bank of mum and dad. So our government has let them down over many, many years. And there's a real sense of hopelessness. And actually, we should be looking at what we can do to improve life for young people.
The announcement we heard from the Prime Minister yesterday is that it would be mandatory for all teenagers to take a full-time placement in the forces or spend a weekend a month volunteering. We have had clarification that it's not going to be enforced by criminal sanctions if you decide not to do it. But what those sanctions were, Luke asked Anne-Marie Trevelyan several times. She said those details will be worked out by a royal commission at a later date. So let's speak to two people with a different perspective on this. Seb Payne is the director of Onward, the centre-right think tank, who thinks young people will welcome the scheme. And Michael Angus works in the voluntary sector. He runs the Barron's Court Project. It's a charity who support people on low incomes, who's less keen on the idea. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Morning.
Seb, let's start with you. Let's say you're 17, the Prime Minister just made this announcement. You'd be excited.
I have to confess, as a 17-year-old, I was fantastically nerdy. And at that point, I was very into computing and that sort of thing. And one of the options that's being proposed under this scheme is cyber defense. And that's something that I think would be great to do. So I would be really interested in that. But I think ultimately, when you look at our research into people's views in getting integrated in the community and what have you, lots of younger people are really supportive of some sort of scheme that will give them better ties into British society. So even though the work we've done on it is slightly different from what the government is actually proposing, I do think that there is a well of voluntary goodwill that needs to be tapped into. We saw it during the COVID pandemic, and I think the majority of young people, according to our polling, would welcome such a scheme.
Yeah, voluntary goodwill, but this would be mandatory. And I guess for you, Michael, that is where the problem becomes. If people say, well, I don't fancy something in the military, I'll just do the volunteering on the weekend instead.
I think the first thing to say is you highlighted that the government said those placements that are in the military will be competitive. And, as a charity, we don't just take anyone to come and volunteer with us. We have a recruitment and selection process. It's also competitive because we need to ensure that we get the right people. We're dealing with very often damaged people. I work in the homelessness sector, and we need to make sure that the volunteers, our staff, are people who are able to work with those guests in a way that actually helps them move forward and benefits them. So, we're not just going to take anyone. And I think that the announcement was just so disappointing. There was so little information that it was scant in detail, obviously. And we need to look at the costs of this, because as a charity, we have costs in employing staff, in employing volunteers or recruiting volunteers. It's not free. People think you're getting something for nothing. You're not, because you have a lot of work to do. You've got DBS checks to undertake, a whole range of things that actually cost the charity in terms of taking on volunteers. So there's a lot more detail to come.
Yeah, Seb, Michael makes a good point to say, actually, is this just going to make our work really complicated, add on a whole load of admin to then have some reluctant teenagers on board who are not going to be helpful?
Well, first of all, that's why the government, or the Conservatives, I should say, are proposing a royal commission, because this is a big scheme and you all are talking about millions of people getting involved in this. So it does require working through all the details on how much it costs and how it will be implemented and how it will work in practice. But the point about the reluctant thing is, I just don't buy that argument, as that it's not backed up by the research to say people don't necessarily want to do this scheme. During the COVID pandemic, 3 and 4 younger people got involved in voluntary work. So there is that well that needs to be tapped into. And I think, much like many other rites of passage, if this becomes something that is just part of coming of age in this country, then I think people will accept it. And we've seen that in other countries, that, in France, in Germany, in Switzerland, in America, they've all introduced similar sorts of schemes in recent years to combat these themes of alienation and unmooredness amongst younger people. So I think that, there are things that need to be worked through on this, but what it's trying to do, I think, is a very good thing, and then we should welcome it.
Yeah, Michael, are you seeing a genuine sort of very healthy appetite from young people who are wanting to volunteer?
We get inundated with requests to volunteer in the charity that I run, and we have to be selective, as I've said, and work out who can do what and how that can enhance the offer we have for our guests. And that's our primary kind of criteria. But I also want to just talk about young people. Many of them have had a really raw deal. So this generation of young people, they're saddled with debt if they go to university. They didn't get support through Sure Start centres and youth clubs. Most of that has gone. They can't get on the housing ladder. They can't even afford to rent anymore, so unless they've got the bank of mum and dad. So our government has let them down over many, many years. And there's a real sense of hopelessness. And actually, we should be looking at what we can do to improve life for young people. If we're talking about 2.5 billion, let's get it spent on reopening some of the youth centres. Let's get it spent on reopening and cutting the waiting list for CAMS, the Child and Adult Mental Health Services. And let's get it spent on support systems that actually help young people to belong, contribute and thrive, rather than a kind of mandatory system that just says you will do as we say, because I just don't think that's good for people. I'd like to just mention the late, great Nelson Mandela, who is one of my heroes. And he talks about volunteering. And he says, there can be no greater gift than that of giving of one's time and energy in helping others without expecting anything in return. This scheme actually demeans that, because you're being told you have to do it. It's mandatory, whether you like it or not.
Seb, that is part of the problem, isn't it? Is that you're saying, no choice. You've got to do it, and you'll be punished if you don't.
Well, I think, as I said, the work that we've done at Onward was focused, and we looked at all different schemes across the world, what has worked, what has not worked, and we focused on a opt-out scheme. So the default is everyone does it, but if you don't want to do it, you can opt out. And I think when you look at this kind of scheme that would go through a Royal Commission, that may be where it ultimately ends up, as opposed to compulsory, because I think you've got to make sure that you obviously do get buy-in from families and parents on this. But
yeah, Seb, do you think the messaging maybe has been a bit unwise, that the first thing people are thinking is, oh my gosh, am I going to sort of be criminalised if I say I don't want to do this?
Okay, well, I mean, I think this thing has started a pretty big debate. I'm not sure the first thing people were thinking about was necessarily being criminalised. I think people have been thinking about how the scheme would work in practice and whether people agree or don't agree with the details that have been put out. But I think the ultimate point is coming back to what was just being said about opportunities for young people. 1 in 5 younger people are economically inactive at the moment, and there's all sorts of reasons for that, but that number has been growing very rapidly. And I think something does need to be done to do that. And in terms of houses and jobs and general economic opportunities, yes, there are other things that need to be done, particularly with getting access to good, affordable housing. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't also look at this fact about that they feel less connected to society and less involved in what you might call sort of British, whatever the British identity is. And that's what this thing is trying to tackle.
Yeah, I think that's the idea. Whether the execution of it is possible, I think, is what's being challenged. Michael, can I just ask, you say you're inundated with people who want to kind of help and volunteer. What do you think is behind that? Is it young people trying to get something on their CV? Or is it something about wanting to help people and say, look, I want, I've got, this is my sort of time, this is my disposable time that I could do something really positive with it? Or is it, getting a step up above your other colleagues?
I think it inherently comes from the fact people are good. I genuinely feel people are good. And most people want to make a difference in society. Most people want to make a difference in other people's lives if they can. Most people don't know how to help other people or those people in most need. So we have to guide them, and we have to tell them, and we have to nurture them and let them flourish in those situations. For me, it's just about that the scheme, when it was announced, just didn't cut through that. It just, it was scant on detail, as I've said. But, we need to have volunteers who are going to add something, who are going to work with our guests in a way that protects the guests and also protects those volunteering, so that they're not traumatized and it's safe for everyone. So that's where I come from.
Thank you both very much for your time. Michael Angus speaking there, works in the voluntary sector, who runs the Barron's Court Project, and Seb Payne, the director of Onward, the centre-right think tank, who thinks all the young people will welcome it.